A story, as yet untitled, by me. They were holding hands, which should have been sweet. The wind whispered through the leafless branches, and as the girl lifted her other hand to tuck her hair behind her ear, she shivered. The shadow shivered too. A bit late, perhaps, but neither child noticed. There was just enough snow to muffle the forest and add a crunch to their steps. Just enough snow to turn the world black and white. Just enough snow to leave an obvious trail. "And you're certain this is the way?" the boy whispered to his sister. He didn't know an awful lot about forests, but he was quite certain they weren't supposed to be this empty. When Lucy had first dragged him off, he was hoping to see a bear or a stag, for the adventure of it, something to brag about to the others. But now, he'd be over the moon at the sight of a hare. He was beginning to need proof that they weren't alone in the world. "Yes!" Lucy's response was clear and bright, and carried so well through the frost-laden air that Edmund thought maybe they'd hear it from the other side of the wardrobe. Maybe they'd come looking. His spirits rose. "It's an odd spot for a lamppost, isn't it, Lou?" "Yes!" As Edmund flinched away from his sister's response, he saw it. Movement in the corner of his eye. Spinning around, he wrenched his hand from Lucy's and stopped. There was nothing. There was nothing in front of him. Less than nothing, actually. He could feel it. An absence of nothing, a void of nothing. Nothing but his shadow. His shadow! A giggle escaped him like a burp. Edmund clamped his teeth together to keep the others down. His shadow! Sweet relief was swirling through him, though it didn't quite reach his toes. But who minds one's toes in such a situation? They're probably just cold. Lucy stepped forward and, having once again interlaced her fingers with her brother's, continued down the path. Somehow, the silent forest found a way to make less noise. "So tell me about this friend, then," said Edmund, rather louder than was necessary. The lack of relief in his toes was starting to creep into the rest of his body, and he might not know an awful lot, about forests in particular, but he didn't trust the silence. Which was astute of him, though, of course, talking louder accomplished nothing. "She's waiting at the lamp-post." "I wish you wouldn't talk like that, Lou." By now there were several shadows surrounding them. If Edmund had cared to look around, he might have noticed that there were too many, that their placement seemed to have nothing to do with the sun, or that they were all the same shape and size, even the ones attached to trees. Unfortunately, he didn't look around. He'd become distracted by his sister's smiling face. She wore not her typical baby sister smile, but a glacial approximation of mirth he found rather horrific. "Lou." "She's ever so kind. She gave me a whole tin full of lemon drops." "Your favorite." "Of course." "I don't like lemon drops." "No." Lucy stopped walking as if to think, though her expression didn't change. "You like—" "Turkish Delight," he whispered. "That's right. Turkish Delight for you, peppermints for Peter, and licorice for Susan." "She knows about them, too?" "Yes." Snow had begun to fall. Thick flakes that gently settled on the children's eyelashes before melting into tears. "Lou." "Come on, Ed," she said, tugging on his hand. But Edmund wouldn't move. "I want to go home, Lou." Lucy let go of Edmund's hand and reached up to softly brush the snow from her brother's hair. She looked him full in the face and, in a voice that was almost her own, said, "It's too late for that." His cheeks, rosy from the cold, grew pale, but before he could say anything, Lucy had grabbed his hand and started to run. "Think of the Turkish Delight!" They didn't have to run far. A bend in the path released them into a clearing, and on the other side was the lamp-post, though Edmund barely noticed it. He didn't spare a thought for the magnificent sleigh next to it, either. It was the woman sitting in the sleigh that captured his attention. He supposed she was beautiful. She was certainly a queen. Edmund would have known that even if she wasn't wearing a crown. She just was a queen. Lucy brought them to a standstill a mere foot from the sleigh. The Queen lifted her arm towards Lucy, and Lucy stepped into the touch. "Darling." Edmund watched as the woman stroked his sister's hair and face, slowly, gently, with love. By the time Lucy turned to face him, the Queen's hand resting on her shoulder, Edmund was sick with envy. It was always Lucy. He wished she'd never been born. And then he met the Queen's gaze and forgot he had any siblings at all. She held out a hand and he stepped forward without thinking. Her touch was feather-light and warm. He loved her. He belonged with her. "You're just the same, both of you." The Queen's gaze moved to Lucy, and Edmund realized that so long as the Queen was touching him, he didn't mind Lucy so much. "What I wouldn't give to see the others." She continued to hold them as she lifted her gaze to the trees. "My kingdom, I suppose." Abruptly, she pulled them closer and kissed the tops of their heads. "They are certainly not making this easier. Get in. We've a bit of a ways to go." The children scrambled in and seated themselves on either side of her, pressing their bodies as close to hers as possible. "Darlings," she said, ruffling their hair. "Now, who would like a sweet?" The sleigh ride passed amicably. While the children emptied their tins of Turkish delight and lemon drops, the Queen sang to them. While they quenched their thirst with mugs of steaming cocoa, the Queen told them stories. And after the sun set and the frost bit, and they were all snuggled together under one of the heavy white reindeer pelts, the children told their own stories. Of growing up, of London, Peter and Susan, the war, their new life in the countryside. The Queen had learned to delay their stories till after dark. The children were not entirely unobservant, and if they noticed her tears, the stories would falter, and the questions would leave awkward silences in their wake. No. Better to listen in shadow, and there were plenty of those. She could imagine their faces, and there was nothing to stop her holding them, stroking their hair, their necks. She simply allowed her tears to freeze to her cheeks and held her children till the end. The stone sat where it always had, circular, solid, stained with the blood of the innocent. The Queen descended from the sleigh unassisted, then turned and lifted Edmund to the ground. She crouched before him and clasped his hands in hers. "Edmund, darling, what do you know?" "That I love you," he answered promptly. "Yes. And?" "That you love me." The Queen smiled her loveliest smile. Edmund didn't question her tears. She kissed his forehead. "Would you go lie down on the stone, please?" Edmund ran off to obey her so quickly she almost fell forward into the snow. As the Queen stood, shaking the moisture from her skirts, she withdrew from a pocket a dagger, crude, sharp, old as the stone behind her. "Ready!" called Edmund. The Queen lifted Lucy down from the sleigh and offered her the hilt. Lucy took it. The prophecy didn't necessitate the sacrifice of her children. Quite the opposite. But the prophecy wasn't for her. She had thought sacrificing them all once would suffice. But they kept finding a way back in. Into life, her kingdom, her heart. She knew one day the prophecy would win, that all 4 of her beloved children would find a way back home, that she would be ruined. She looked forward to it. But she was the Queen. She couldn't just allow it to happen. So she was vigilant, and when she caught them, in 1s or 2s, she killed them. Or let them kill each other. The Queen turned to survey the stone. Edmund was dead. Thoroughly. This time he'd managed to put up a fight. His sister lay gasping next to his corpse. The Queen pulled the dagger out of her dead son's chest and across her dying daughter's throat with one swift, practiced stroke. She used a handful of snow and the reindeer pelt to clean the dagger. She didn't clean her hands. "Till next time, my darlings," In the dark and snow, the Queen didn't have to look to know that the throng of shadows following her home had grown by two.